to look at how we recover. So one of the things at Rajasthan Royals and any cricket team that I work with is really focus on recovery, because without recovery, you don't have performance. Without recovery or efficient and effective recovery, you have injury or increased injury rate.
Yeah.
And so now we need to look at the entire sort of gambit of things around that athlete. It's not just training for performance. So like we said, on the back of the match day data, it's now looking at their recovery protocols. And then it's also looking at now a really big aspect of that is mental health and the COVID bubble environments that may be influencing both of those things as well.
Hi everyone, it's Doc M, your champion of well-being, and welcome to another series of the recording The Edge. And today I'm really excited because I've got a really dear old friend of mine who we're going to be talking about performance, well-being, and longevity. He is the physiotherapist, the chief physiotherapist and chief medical officer of the Rajasthan Royals, which is one of the premier cricket clubs in the Indian Premier League. Before that, he served as the physiotherapist both to the Bangladeshi national cricket team and to the Indian national cricket team as well. He hails from Australia, but I think it's fair to say that he's a resident Indian and he spends most of his time here living in Mumbai. I've known him now for probably around 8 to 10 years, and we first stepped out onto the cricket field together, playing as social members for the Cricket Club of India. And we've had many, many great evenings playing under lights at the Brabant Stadium. Everyone, I welcome John Gloster. John, how are you?
Good morning, Doc. Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, great to be here. And you brought back some good memories there about the nights under the lights at the CCI. And it's a great honor to be not just a member of the CCI, but to be able to play on that great ground. So there's fantastic memories there. And it's probably, at least 8 or 10 years that we've been interacting. And of my 16 years now in India, I'm almost a permanent resident.
Absolutely. I hope we get to play again soon. And what I love to always ask every guest that I have on the show when we begin is where are you? Because we're all doing this remotely, but where in the world are you today?
I'm still in Bombay, backwards and forwards between various IPL tournaments around the globe. And but at the moment, home in Bombay. Bombay is home for me. Currently in a hotel actually in the northern part of Bombay due to some meetings I had out here. So I think all of us have changed our lifestyle significantly. Normally we'd be traveling a lot more, we'd be exposing ourselves into the rest of India and the rest of the world through our careers, but currently we're sort of having to confine ourselves more to the great city of Mumbai and actually exploring that a lot more recently, which has been a bit of fun too.
Yeah. And what we're going to be doing over the course of the next hour is touching on various facets of your career journey and the areas of research and now the practicalities of that you do with your performers, with your athletes, with your foundations, and your interest levels as well. So I'm going to begin with a very broad question, which is the role of exercise on the human body. Now, most of us, when we think of that, we think of it as a good thing. But of course, exercise is a double-edged sword, and you're at the front lines of that when the high-performing athletes that you look after. So when you look at the domain of exercise, what does it mean to you, and how does it affect the body, both in a good way and in a bad way?
Yeah, look, I think we've got to understand that exercise is something that should be with us as part of the journey through life and should become habitual. And there's two categories. There's obviously the non-performing elite athletes, and then probably three categories. They're now recreational athletes, and then the everyday individual. But exercise plays a role for every single one of them. The amount of exercise and the degree of intensity of exercise obviously varies between all three. But it's critical that everybody inculcates that into their overall lifestyle from a health and well-being perspective for all of us, the everyday person. And the science tells us that that's critical and essential. But when we move into the sort of semi-professional and the professional and elite athletes, then monitoring how much exercise and how much training they do becomes critical, because we use exercise and training as a protective mechanism. So when we talk about protecting an athlete or a cricketer, what we're doing is we're protecting them by not wrapping them in cotton wool as such, but exposing them to the stresses that they're going to be subjected to in their chosen sports, and then training for that accordingly. So protection comes from understanding intimately the stresses within an individual sport, and then translating that into the training environment. And that's where technology has been our best friend over the last sort of 5 to 10 years, because we're now able to understand more and more just what the match intensities are and athlete intensities are during on-field performance. And we can then now use that data to then go back and match that in training. Because effectively, your match performances becomes the baseline for training. If you're not meeting those performance markers in your training environment, then you're actually not prepared for the match environment. So therefore, there's a risk of injury. So when we look at our elite athletes and our elite cricketers, we need to make sure that we're mimicking our match situations and match intensities in the training environment. I know we've talked about that for years and years, and we've attempted to do that, but we've never really had the raw data until GPS tracking came along, and the really high-end GPS trackers like the catapult devices we use at Rajasthan Royals. It wasn't until that came to light that we realized just how good an athlete you need to be to perform at the highest level in cricket. We always felt that cricketers were just reasonably sedentary and they didn't do a lot on the field. But, when we see the numbers today, particularly in T20 cricket, and how those numbers have changed in the high-speed running efforts over the last sort of 5 years or so, then we've realized the value that in order to protect them from injury, how we need to use that in our training environment. So one of the biggest eye-openers for us, particularly after using these GPS devices, was the changes in the way we trained and the intensities in the way we trained, but also allowing us now to have a conversation with the player around why we do what we do in training. Why are you doing these repeated sprint efforts? And also, it's been a wonderful communication device with the coaching staff, because coaches, as you know, are very reluctant to let their players go away from the skill side to train physically. But now that we have the raw data to show to the coach, and I've heard it, the expression where we're now using, we're using ability to use the conversation now, but and between science and sweat. Okay, so we're now able to sort of make sense of both those areas, and so the coach now is buying into the whole fitness side of particularly cricket in this country.
That's fascinating, because I remember reading a study which you did on your athletes, your cricketers at the IPL, which you shared earlier in the year, which we last spoke about when we caught up for lunch at the beginning of this year. And it was really fascinating because, we often think of even within the sport of cricket, that a cricketer is a cricketer. But what your GPS tracking data was showing was that the biomechanics, the distance covered, the fuel utilization, the energy expenditure of a fast bowler versus a batsman versus a fielding specialist, fundamentally different. And therefore, you've got to plan for all of those things very, very differently. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, you can no longer give a generic training program to a cricketer. It needs to be individualized for not just the individual differences in that player, but also what discipline they are undertaking during the game, whether that be batting, fielding, or even wicket keeping. And the bowlers we need to treat very differently again. But we can never do that efficiently or effectively without data. And we now have that data available to us. And as you said, it's quite surprising when we look at total distances covered now by some of these T20 athletes. They're up around 10 kilometers or so in total distance covered within the duration of an IPL game or a T20 game, which is, and then we look at the high speed effort intensities on the back of that, they're not dissimilar to EPL or some of the high level football data sets that we've looked at. So it makes sense now. People say, well, why are you looking to train like footballers? Well, the numbers tell us that the efforts are very, very similar, particularly the high-speed running efforts and the total distances covered. So we're learning a lot from other sports. I pull in a lot of learnings from other sports to improve our cricketers purely on the back of data. And we've got people like Jens Bangsbo, the eminent physiologist from Denmark, to thank for a lot of that.
Yeah.
Jens is the fellow that invented the yo-yo test. That was invented primarily as a football test. But given now the relationship between football and cricket in terms of efforts, the short form of the game, it does make sense that the yo-yo test plays a role in testing or training individuals for this form of the game. So, the learnings from other sport, I've always said that we need to look to other sports to improve the knowledge and understanding and protect our players more in our sports. This is cricket I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And we need to be open to new inputs and ideas from other sports, because it certainly helped me. The other sport that I've often looked at is water polo, believe it or not. People say, why you look at water polo players? Because water polo is probably the sport that demands most of your shoulders. And cricketers have lots of shoulder injuries and shoulder issues, because it's an overhead throwing sport. But the ones who have probably the most stresses and strains on their shoulders are water polo players. Because they're not anchored below the waist, there's no stable base for them to work from. So all of fourth generation and shock absorption for the shoulder has to come through the shoulder joint complex. So looking at them for ways to improve shoulder stability, shoulder strength, ranges of movement, is fascinating. And so, I always encourage young physios and young medicos who I work with to look outside of your sport for ways to improve your sport. And I think it's helping us a lot in the world of cricket.
Yeah. And a subtle theme that you mentioned actually in one of your opening sentences, which is around this idea that you train at the match intensity. That's your sort of baseline training. And I think that's something which is not very familiar to people, right? Even, weekend warrior like me who, training for a full marathon, we train at very subpar levels. And then we suddenly wonder, then why am I not performing on race day?
Again, we could never have done that or taken that sort of mantra without data to prove that it's effective and efficient to do so. But on the back of that, you need to then look at recovery, because if you're consistently working at high intensities, we now then need to start monitoring load, and we then need to start focusing more on recovery. And in tournaments like the IPL, where there's a very short space of time between games, and in a normal year of IPL, there'd be a lot of travel as well. I've always said that a travel day is not a recovery day. Okay, because it's very stressful on the body. So we need to look at how we recover. So one of the things at Rajasthan Royals and any cricket team that I work with is really focus on recovery, because without recovery, you don't have performance. Without recovery or efficient and effective recovery, you have injury or increased injury rate. And so now we need to look at the entire sort of gambit of things around that athlete. It's not just training for performance. So like we said, on the back of the match day data, it's now looking at their recovery protocols. And then it's also looking at now a really big aspect of that is mental health and the COVID bubble environments that may be influencing both of those things as well. And then when we drill down on recovery, probably the most critical component of that recovery for me is sleep and nutrition. So what are the strategies then? So then the sub layers under that are, okay, what are the sleep strategies that we've now got to look at? What are influencing sleep? How do we map and monitor sleep? And the same goes for nutrition. So I'm a really big one for then having this umbrella of recovery, but then there are various layers and various boxes that need to be ticked under that for every single athlete individually. And by individually, I mean even to the extent where they're all blood tested individually. So we use blood markers before the tournament to identify any red flags they may have, but also give me an insight into how we need to be recovering these athletes, particularly with nutrition. And it gives me a lot of insight into those athletes. And you'd be really surprised to know that a few years ago, when we tested all our cricketers and all the athletes that I was working with across India, which was quite a large cohort, approximately 30% of them, believe it or not, were pre-diabetic. And that means they've got an HbA1c of greater than 5.7. So that is a really frightening statistic, because if that's what your elite athlete cohort, Indian cohort, is presenting with, who are the fittest, strongest, most active individuals and probably the most well monitored in terms of nutrition and recovery. What does it say about the rest of the general population? So I'm really keen on taking all these learnings and bringing them back to people like yourself, Doc M, to then use that knowledge to help the general population. Because if that number is 20 to 30% in our elite athlete population, that means probably at least 50 to 60% of our general population are pre-diabetic. And we know that anyway from the numbers that we're now seeing.
Yeah.
And that is pretty scary. But what are the learnings that I can then bring back to the table to benefit everybody on the back of that? I've always looked at my position working with elite athletes and with teams like, the Indian team and the IPL as an opportunity for everybody to benefit from that. So I use the analogy of Formula One, okay? And a lot of people hear me talk about this, where if you think about Formula One and all the new innovations and technologies that go into a Formula One car, like traction control, disc brakes, turbocharging, all these new technologies eventually end up in your road car, okay? That's basically the testing ground for new technologies that eventually end up in your road car. Well, the same thing with me. All the new innovations, technologies, learnings that I can take out of my elite sports space at some point should come back and have to come back and benefit the general population, particularly in this area that we're all talking about is health and wellness, kids, nutrition, exercise, activity. So it's not just about focusing on the elite athletes for me is my point here. It's the bigger picture of how John Gloster in India 16 years later, what can he do to deliver back into the population on the back of my 23 years or 24 years of working with elite international cricketers, but also 27 years of working with international athletes.
Yeah. There's so much there, John. And we've literally spoken for these things for hours, and we can continue speaking for these things for hours. And there's so much to unpack in just the last 5 minutes that you spoke about. So I'm going to try and do some justice to that through the rest of the program. Specifically, we're going to get deep dive into recovery and sleep. I see, for folks who are watching this on video, you would notice that John's wearing the Aura ring. And so we're going to talk about sleeping. And I know that's been an experiment that you've been doing with your athletes as well. We're going to talk about blood-based markers. In fact, one of the last times that John and I caught up for lunch, I was sharing that post-COVID, when I had COVID, my HbA1c jumped to 6.1. And then through the intermittent fasting protocols that I've been on, I've now seen that come down to 5.7. I'm a fit, active guy, and I still have such a high level. And then, of course, I've been testing my fasting insulin levels on the back of that. So we can talk about that as well. But
love to, and the other thing on the back of your COVID as well, sorry, Doc M, is that what people need to understand is that you may physically feel okay post-COVID infection, but on the back of the testing that particularly the blood testing we've done on all our cricketers who've had COVID and other individuals, it's really telling just how much toll it takes on certain organs in the body. So the liver markers, for example, take a long time to recover. So physiologically, you're still recovering. So we need to be aware of that. Even, again, the everyday person who's had COVID, you may feel okay, but let your body recover for a longer period of time, because there are certain markers that are still showing stress on your body physiologically that we need to respect. That's a wonderful point.
So let's, I want to talk about sort of stretching when it comes to injury prevention and performance. But before we do that, because we've spoken so much about the biological biomarkers for strain and stress on the body for recovery, let's maybe go down that path for a while, because it just makes most sense now. So when you look at your composite athlete, your asset, as you call them, right? These are your assets for your team. What are the 5 or 6 main data points that you're measuring, looking at, either in terms of wearables, in terms of blood-based or physiological assessments? What are those 5 or 6 key things that are on that dashboard that you would be examining?
Yeah. For me, the blood's probably number one, because it just gives me an insight into that individual. And I don't think anybody should be, and because I'm responsible for the nutrition protocols for those athletes, I don't think anybody should be issuing a dietary program or a nutritional intervention without first understanding the bloods of that individual. And that doesn't matter whether you're a normal everyday person or an elite athlete. Otherwise, you don't know what you're fueling. You don't know how that individual is going to respond. So bloods for me are really important, particularly HbA1c, fasting insulin. I like to look at their inflammatory markers, so high sensitive CRP, C-reactive protein. We do get some cortisol profiles as well. Again, these are all markers of stress. Creatine kinase. I really like to look at their lipid profiles, but I look at them very differently than most GPs or most doctors will look at them, because I'm looking at them from a long-term health perspective. And liver markers, again, are really critical. And some of their other risk markers, cardiac risk markers, so homocysteine, lipoprotein(a). But in general, and the obvious ones, which are B12, D3, and some of their other vitamin markers. But really importantly for me is that what this starts, it starts a conversation with that athlete. Because if they see that you're taking a genuine interest in not just their performance and recovery now, but the long-term health of them, then it immediately establishes this rapport with the athlete or the cricketer that otherwise you may not have. So, for example, some of those guys that came back from their testing and we saw that they were pre-diabetic and quite almost diabetic without them even knowing, it was amazing how that then started a relationship with that individual about how do we change that. And then coming back 8 weeks later, retesting and being back to normal, so reversing their pre-diabetic status, and then the sort of gratitude around that. Because I say to all my athletes, yes, I'm here to help you improve performance and today, but more importantly for me is where you're going to be in 15 to 20 years' time. And I have that knowledge with me through your blood. So that's number one. So blood's the number one. And the other one is you touched on briefly before is sleep, and how do we track sleep? And sleep for me, and Shane Warne always used to say, sleep is the best medicine. And the older I've got, the smarter that saying has become, because it really does make sense. So yes, we track sleep with our Oura rings, patterns of sleep. We track on the back of that recovery, we track heart rate variability, as you know, and then what influences heart rate variability. And so I think that's a really important one. And nutrition is the thing that probably underpins all of this. So poor nutrition, poor sleep, poor nutrition, poor recovery, poor nutrition, poor blood markers. So we cannot look at an athlete, or I don't believe in any individual, and make assessments on them without looking at their nutritional profile and what they're eating. Because if we can't fix that, then we're really going to struggle to fix or have positive influence on all the other things. So they're my sort of three big go-tos, as I said. But the whole understanding is that we're here to protect you. And protect you means arming you with knowledge, arming you with the tools to then make change yourselves. Because I'm not going to be here forever. I'm only here with you for the next 8 weeks or so. I want you to take this knowledge back to your family, to your friends, and start filtering that sort of through the community as well. And if they know that it's coming from someone like me, with good science background, with good research background, and they see it play out positively in their own lives, then they will embrace it and then obviously take that forward. So that's the big picture for me.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's very useful, very practical, and so much of it is translational, not just for elite level athletes, but weekend warriors and even folks who are just looking to improve their performance and, as I keep saying, gain their own human edge as well. I'm going to switch track a little bit now, and a question which is often a debated one. And my wife is, John, she's a sports physiotherapist, and she trained in Melbourne. So we have these conversations conversations at home all the time, which is the role of stretching and the science of stretching, both for injury prevention and performance as well. And honestly, when one looks at the literature, there are like so many things. There are arguments to be made on both sides. Is it useful? Is it not? Does it really benefit? Does it not? When should it be done? Before, afterwards? Who should be doing it, etc. What's been your experiences? And if you do use it, how do you prescribe it to your athletes?
So again, everything's individualized because everybody responds differently to certain inputs. But if you look at the data and the actual research around this, there is no studies that show that particularly static stretching actually reduces injury rates. It's not detrimental and it doesn't increase injury rates, but there's nothing really to show or prove that it decreases rates of injury. So that's static stretching.
And just define static stretching for those who are not familiar, and the difference between that and dynamic stretching.
Yeah, so static stretching is when you hold a muscle on stretch for a sustained period of time, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 20 seconds, however long it may be. So, we know, in the understanding of how muscle works is what we now think is that when you put a muscle on sustained stretch for a long period of time, what you're actually doing is there's nerves that run through that muscle, and all those little nerves are encapsulated or wrapped with very small blood vessels. And then when we put a muscle on stretch for a long period of time, we stretch those nerves. And for that period of time, we're occluding that blood supply to the nerve, if that makes sense. So it stops the blood supply for that period of time that you're under that sustained stretch through the nerve itself. So then when we go off the stretch, the blood rushes back to that nerve and can sometimes irritate it.
Yeah.
Okay. So you then may get a recoil almost, John, afterwards.
May I just say for our viewers who are not quite following, what John is basically describing is when you remove the blood supply from any part of the body, I mean, the body, every cell in the body requires blood because of the oxygen and the nutrients. When you remove the blood supply, you're effectively creating a buildup of toxins. You're leading to micro injury events, which when you suddenly gush blood back in, all of that then needs to be removed. And that's quite often why, you have the strain injuries and also, like the heart. If you don't give blood to the heart, you develop your heart attacks, etc. So that basically what you're describing is at a microvascular level, this is affecting the nerves within the muscle body itself. Yeah. Carry on. Sorry.
That's right. Yeah. So that's wonderful and wonderfully put, Doc. So do we therefore use static stretching? Now you got to look at the psychological side of most athletes. Because most athletes grew up doing static stretching, that they somehow believe that's related to their performance, and it may or may not be. Would I take static stretching away from somebody who's been doing it for a prolonged period of time and had no adverse effect from it? No, I probably wouldn't. Is static stretching something that I incorporate into my stretching routines and education for young cricketers? No, because what we do know is that it's one thing to stretch the muscle, but it's more important to stretch the neural tissue that supplies that muscle. So what I tend to do is dynamic stretching or movement stretches, because nerves like mobility. So when you stretch a nerve, it doesn't like to be held static, like we said before. It likes to be mobilized, so moved. So when we do our stretches for, say, a warm-up for a cricket match, you'll see us doing mobility mobile stretches. So they're stretches that incorporate movement patterns that the sport that's involved in the sport, but it also at the same time is directed towards stretching certain large neural pathways. So we look at the whole sciatic chain for the lower limb, femoral nerve chain for the anterior lower limb. We look at upper limb neural stretches for the upper body and shoulders, and then for the lumbar spine as well. So movement plays a very big role in all of our stretching that we do for our cricketers. So if you look at my stretching routines and warm-ups, you will not see any static stretching during the combined team warm-up. You may see it with certain individuals because that's become part of their personal preparation and probably more psychological personal preparation for the game themselves.
Sure.
So
Sure.
that's the difference. Is there data to support the dynamic stretching over static stretching? There's probably more conclusive data to say that neural stretching is more effective to prevent injury than static stretching, but the jury's still out overall. So I'm saying if it's part of your routine, continue doing it because it's not detrimental to you. Okay. But on the other hand, if you're looking at static stretching to improve performance, then there's no data to suggest that it will significantly aid in performance or reducing your injury risk.
Yeah, fantastic. So dynamic stretching prior to the activity, try and match the type of stretching to the muscle group and the type of activity that you'll be doing, the discipline, and focus on the large neural connections which exist so that you get that sort of mobility built in before you put it under real stress in game situation. That's pre-game. What about post-game and cool down? What's the role there, and is there any changes to that regime at all?
So as soon as we get into the post-match, then you're looking at recovery. So recovery starts the minute they step off that field, and in some cases before they even step off the field, with some sort of warm down, particularly if they've been in a dynamic, highly physical environment prior to the end of the game. So warm down for us will involve some level of gentle dynamic stretching. It will involve some level of activity. So ideally, I like to get the guys into the pool as part of their warm down if it's available. And most grounds in the world now have access to a pool. So if you have time and access, we will use the pool immediately after a match. So movement still plays a role in recovery. Yeah, I don't know if any of you have been watching the Tour de France. These guys are probably some of the greatest athletes in the world, cycling, a couple of 100 kilometers every day up and down mountains, stressing their systems for say 5 or 6 hours every day. Then what they do as part of their warm down, they then do a 30 or 40 kilometer bike ride at a much lower intensity as part of their warm down. And I've worked with some of the Tour de France cyclists, and it's unbelievable to see that they'll go for a 30K bike ride as part of their warm down after having been, annihilated on a mountain for the last 6 hours. But that's their warm down routine. So movement does play a very large role in warming down after high intensity effort. And then we look at overall recovery, and studies show that particularly after high intensity efforts involving the lower limbs, so running, sprinting, and sports like football, Australian rules football, and cricket, and rugby, a lot of the studies come out of rugby, is that it really takes up to 72, even up to 96 hours to fully recover. And when we look at recovery, we look at obviously CK levels in the blood, because they're an indicator of muscle trauma. On the back of those findings, on the back of vertical jump tests and broad jump tests and quadriceps strength, we see significant reductions up until about between 56 and 72 hours post high intensity activity. We still see signs of, yet to see signs of full recovery in all those parameters. So it's recommended that there should be at least a minimum of 3 days between high intensity efforts such as an EPL game or an IPL game in order to ensure that they're fully recovered against all those parameters, those testing parameters, in order to mitigate injury risk. So in order to prevent injury going into the next game. So recovery, therefore, in that first sort of 24 to 48 hours is critical. And recovery, like we said, involves movement, early movement. It involves massage. It involves what we call recovery pumps to stimulate circulation in the legs. It involves using the game-ready machines. Yes, we use cryotherapy and sort of contrast therapies, so hot and colds to stimulate circulation. Nutrition, hydration, sleep, and then the next day, movement again. So there's probably 7 or 8 things that come into or come under that umbrella of recovery, and even things like what we wear. So people don't think that what you wear can influence recovery, but some of the studies show that the new garments that have the bio ceramic garments that are treated with bioceramics, that what we call FIR garments, far infrared capturing garments, they can improve recovery. They can improve sleep. So it may only be by a very small percentage, but anything that improves recovery, whether it be 0.5%, 1%, 10%, whatever it is beneficial to that athlete. Because cumulatively, if we're improving sleep, we're improving circulation, we're improving their nutrition, so therefore bringing down inflammation. That's all beneficial to the overall outcome of what we term recovery.
Yeah. And what's so important is that what John is talking about is not just limited to athletes. I was reading a study recently looking at CKMB, which is the creatine kinase released by the myocardium, the heart. And what was really fascinating was that post a full marathon, if you measure CKMB levels in full marathon runners, you will see levels as high as those you would see in an acute STEMI or ST elevation event, myocardial infarct. And that was that's incredible, because a lot of people think, oh, running is great for the cardiovascular system, it's great for the heart, etc. They don't realize actually the strain you're putting on the body, particularly these super long distance events, causes such a high degree of strain. What I've often found,
what you said in the first part of your conversation, Doc, was exercise versus extreme exercise. So there's significant benefits of exercising, but there can be detrimental effects of high performance and extreme exercising or extreme sport performance. So you need to be prepared for those things. You need to be prepared for the extreme events, the high performance events, and that process is long and extended. But the benefits of daily exercise, limited, moderate intensity daily exercise, are critical and crucial. So we need to, like I said, put them into 2 buckets. And for the extreme athletes, you need to be prepared for that, because without preparation, you do run the risk of suffering an extreme event, quite possibly.
What's interesting for folks like me who sit on the sidelines, there are these players that we love to watch who just seem to be so injury prone, like Rafael Nadal recently in tennis, Jimmy Anderson, the great English fast bowler. There are these people in different sports whom they're obviously getting the best care in the world. They've got the best sort of disciplines and folks and brains looking after them. And then there are other folks. I had on my show last weekend an Indian runner. She's actually a ground staff for Air India, and she's now training to run around the world. And she's done all of these records where she runs 70 kilometers a day for 200 days at a stretch. And, she doesn't wear a single wearable. She doesn't monitor any aspect of her nutrition. She was mentioning that she loves vada pav. She loves eating idlis. She just ran across India. So she eats every street food that she can. She obviously sleeps 6 to 7 hours a day, but, there's no real science. She's a purist. She loves the sport, and that's how she does it. So where the position that you're in, and you have all these various degrees of athletes that you look after, are there some telltale signs that you can look at an individual and think, okay, this is someone whom I'm going to have to watch very carefully, because there's something in there, biomechanically, blood-based, genetically, enthusiasm, something in there that makes this individual injury prone? And if that's the case, how do you manage that person for their long-term performance over that 15 to 20 years of being an asset for you?
Yeah, I think we now have more information available to us, and some of the genetic testing that we can now, access gives us little insights into perhaps those that might be more, particularly ligamentous injuries, because there are certain markers now that show, am I susceptible or more susceptible to certain injuries and illnesses? So we can definitely pick up certain red flags based on genetic information that we have from athletes. So that gives us a good heads up. The blood markers, again, give us another really good heads up. But the most important thing is history. And I've always said that, yes, we screen athletes to look for red flags and potential injury risks, musculoskeletal screening, mental health screening, all the various screenings we do. But the most important one is history and understanding the history of that athlete. I remember talking to the guy, a guy called Burgess, who was the head of Liverpool football. He was head of high performance for Liverpool football, along with Dr. Peter Bruckner. And he was saying that we often don't listen to the athlete enough. And this is something that I've always done in the subcontinent, is listen to the athlete, because their history will tell you more than anything about them and whether they need changing or not. Yeah. I have this saying where if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And your history will tell that. If you've got an athlete who's 31, 32, he's playing at the best of his career, he's performing to the highest ability, he's not getting injured, but he has terrible screening data, like his muscular health screening might be poor, he might have imbalances, he might have all these various neural deficiencies, etc. But do I intervene and change those things that we see as problems in their screening? No, you don't, because history tells you that this guy's been performing at the highest level for X number of years. It's not affecting his performance. He's not getting injured. So why would you intervene and change something that his body has obviously adapted to? So I think as young medicos and young physios, we're very enthusiastic and very keen to screen everything and everyone and find problems. But the real question is, do we intervene? And that's where history comes into it. If you take a really good history and talk to their coaches, talk to their high performance managers about their on-field performances, most times we will not intervene, despite seeing some pretty glaringly obvious problems in their screening data. So history tells us more than perhaps anything. And because we have athletes coming in all the time, changing teams. Every time there's an auction, there's new players coming in, and we screen them all. Absolutely, we have to look for these red flags. But I will take note of those red flags, and should problems start to arise or performance start to dip, then we know we've got something to go back to adjust. But if they're currently not showing injury, they're currently not showing poor performances on the back of that, then we do not intervene. So that's probably more important than anything, I believe, is getting a really good history of that athlete. And you can only do that if you have a really good relationship with that athlete. And you can only do that if you have a really good relationship with the rest of your support staff around you.
Yeah. It's very similar. I remember when I was doing my surgical training in London, one of the consultants, we were talking about what makes a good surgeon, and he was talking me through the 3 phases of life that a surgeon goes through. The first phase is where you're just watching people and you're basically learning the trade. The second stage is then you're learning the skill. So how do you actually operate on a particular type of procedure, the anatomy, etc. He said the last stage, which is the most important, is the difference between knowing when to operate and when not to operate, which patient you actually put under the knife and which you just say, let's just leave it as it be. And that's the excitement of youth, right? We always want to jump in and fix something and do something and make ourselves useful. But your wisdom is saying that actually it's knowing when to just step back and let nature play its course and then correct as required.
Exactly. And that's experience, and that's clinical experience. Like I said, after 27 years, I'm in a position, perhaps a better position to make those judgments than somebody who hasn't had so much experience. But that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm talking to you, and that's why you contribute so heavily to this space, is because you give this sort of information and you give these learnings to young medicos, young physios, young clinicians around India and the world that there are learnings out there that are really valuable for you that not only may save that athlete's career, but also your own careers. Yeah. So, I really appreciate the opportunity for all of us to come onto platforms like this to spread our learnings and our experiences, because that's the most important thing.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about nutrition. Nutrition is something which is very dear to both of us, and we both use it very effectively, I think, in the spaces that we operate in. And I'm going to begin by something which is very popular in these days, which is intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating or calorie restriction. What are your thoughts on that? And are you a practitioner? Are you a believer? Do you use it on your athletes?
Yeah, look, Doc, I think there's a time and place for everything. And I think, nutrition is something that obviously it's an evolving field and there's so much new information coming out. And one of the new sort of an exciting things that has come around recently is this concept of intermittent fasting. And I do like it and I do practice it and I do sort of recommend it to certain individuals because it is based on good science. And it's probably a practice that a lot of us, particularly in India, have been practicing for millennia anyway, in some form or another. And so I think it's really important that we go back and look at why and some of the reasons it was embraced culturally here anyway, but also go back and look at how we actually were as human beings, a million years ago, and look at, how we can bring that into the modern age to be healthier. And so intermittent fasting for me can be very, very advantageous for those, particularly the athlete who is looking to lose weight. So that's one. But more importantly for me is the athlete who's looking to control their HbA1c or to what we call improve their insulin sensitivity, the ability for their body to see and use insulin more efficiently. So intermittent fasting combined with a good exercise routine that involves some resistance exercise, I think has a really positive role to play in both our elite athlete cohort, but also more importantly in the general population. And it's because there is sound science and sound research behind it. And we've only got to look at the change in, and you've seen it yourself, you've only look at the change in certain parameters or certain blood markers that we see as being really important, positive change on the back of, intermittent fasting. And so it's something that I do practice regularly. It's something that I do to kickstart, some people look at it as, a bit of a kick in the backside, to your whole, physiology as such. And I think we need that every now and again. We need to find ways to sort of re-stimulate our systems, particularly when it comes to how our body sees insulin and what it does with it. Because the majority of the population, as we said before, up to 60% of the Indian population are pre-diabetic, which means that their insulin's not doing what it should do. So what is a really simple, easy way to help your body overcome that? And intermittent fasting is certainly that. Nutrition, you and I have this relationship with nutrition and we've had it for a long time. And at times it can be controversial, but when we keep coming back to the basics of physiology and how our bodies respond to certain foods, it's actually pretty common sense. And I think we do overcomplicate it. I think we've overcomplicated nutrition. And in the India context, again, I think we've overcomplicated it. So there are a lot of, and when I'm educating our athletes, I tell them to look at 2 or 3 key things. One is anti-inflammatory, because inflammation is an athlete's biggest enemy, because that's going to inhibit performance and it's going to inhibit recovery. So therefore injury risk goes up. Anti-inflammation is a source of all disease. So for the general population, if we can reduce inflammation, we're going to reduce the chance of developing chronic diseases. So look at anti-inflammatory foods. And when we look at anti-inflammatory foods, it just means we're looking at the foods that really come down to 2 words, and that's just real food. And if we go back and ask our grandparents, again, particularly in the India context, go back and ask your grandparents, what were they eating when they were growing up? And I think if we ask that question, I think we're pretty safe around encapsulating foods and food groups that are anti-inflammatory and fall into that real food category. And if we can keep it as simple as that, then most of us won't go wrong. So you combine real food with intermittent fasting, I think then you're onto something that you're going to see rapid changes in your physiology as well as your overall general outlook and health as an individual. When we look at real food, and people say, well, what's real food? Well, real food for me is something, and I think it was Johnny Bowden or Dr. Johnny Bowden from the US who said that when you walk into a supermarket, you either go straight ahead to the end or you go full right or full left. Because straight ahead is normally where all the produce, like meats and unprocessed products are.
Yeah.
Left is normally where all the fruit and vegetables.
Yeah.
And then right is normally where the dairy section is, or so everything in the middle, which is on the shelves, is processed.
Yeah.
Steer clear of that.
Right.
Or I think it was Michael Pollan said that if it's been dug out of the ground, plucked off a tree, fished or caught, then it's pretty safe. I think it was John Yudkin, Dr. John Yudkin, who said if it's white, it's out. So white flour, white sugars, anything that was white is out. So there are a lot of very smart people out there who've been looking at this whole conversation around food and trying to simplify it. And I think that's what your job is and my job is, to try and simplify it on the back of good science and trying to deliver just key messages to everybody that makes sense in the context of where you live. So for me, it's real food, it's regional, it's anti-inflammatory. And if you want to break it down a little more, it's no sugars and no processed foods. I think if we can just stick to those, because then you're dealing with the insulin issue, you're dealing with the inflammation issue, you're dealing with the weight issue. So you can basically kill 2 or 3 birds with one stone just by keeping it that simple.
Yeah. I just want to mention this because, John, you've spoken about insulin a few times today, and there's this misunderstanding in society, and honestly, it exists in doctors as well, because I remember even my time at med school, we think of diabetes as a disease of sugar, but actually we've understood now it's actually a disease of insulin. And as John was saying, it's basically your cell's inability to recognize and then deal with the insulin in a way which effectively manages the carbohydrate, the sugar load that you're putting in the body. And so oftentimes young medicos, we fall into the trap that, we're just going to top the insulin up. We'll give exogenous insulin. We'll crash that HbA1c down, and then the patient will be okay. That's not the long-term solution. That's a very short-term way. And you're leading to long-term damage, because it's the insulin which then creates all of that hypertrophy, blood vessel changes, leading to angiogenesis, cancer, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
I think that's a really important point, Doc. And again, let's make this simple about what does insulin do? So many people don't know what insulin does. If you go back, insulin was discovered in 1921 by Banting, and he looked at insulin, and insulin was first called the fat-storing hormone because it's a hormone-driven system. Insulin is a hormone, and it was actually called the fat-storing hormone. So that's its primary role, is to convert blood glucose, excess blood glucose, and store it as fat. That's its number one role. So it makes sense that, but it's the driver also of whether we lose fat or not, okay? Because in order to oxidize your fat stores or use them as energy, insulin needs to fall. The biggest issue we have now is people look at a study like an HbA1c or blood glucose and only look at that. Whereas I say you need to look at HbA1c, that's fine. And if it's high, you need to know why is it high. What else should we be looking at? You need to look at fasting insulin at the same time. Because without the knowledge of fasting insulin, you don't quite know why your HbA1c is high, if you understand. Because if you've got a really high fasting insulin, but a high HbA1c, your blood glucose levels are really high, that means that you're insulin resistant. That means you've got plenty of insulin in your system, but your body's not recognizing it. It's become resistant to insulin because it's been exposed to such high levels of insulin for such a long time. It's a bit like antibiotic resistance. Eventually they don't work. Well, that's the same thing. If you've got a high HbA1c, but you've got a very low insulin, that's because your pancreas, which produces the little beta cells in the pancreas, the islet cells in the pancreas, which produce insulin, are fatigued. That means they're not producing enough insulin in order for you to keep your HbA1c or your blood glucose in check. And that's the core understanding of diabetes. Diabetes is the inability to control your blood glucose, put very simply. What controls your blood glucose is your insulin. So let's focus on the insulin, exactly like you said, and understand how insulin works and what it does. So if blood glucose goes up, insulin comes in, it either uses it and converts it into, and it takes it into the cell where it's used as fuel, the blood glucose. If you're not exercising or requiring for fuel, it then stores it in your fat cells as fat, as adipose tissue. When insulin levels in the blood drop, so if you're intermittent fasting, or you really reduce the amount of carbohydrates that you're consuming, insulin then drops. That is the signal for you to then start oxidizing or using your fat stores for fuel. So therefore you lose weight. And it really doesn't, you really don't need to look at it any more than that. So it's very, very obvious. And I was frightened the other day when I went and saw somebody in hospital who's a diabetic and was given a diabetic breakfast. They were prescribed a banana, a piece of toast, a bowl of oats, and there was and a fruit juice, I think, was on there as well.
What?
That's a diabetic's breakfast? It's ridiculous. Just in that one piece of toast, that will raise your blood glucose equivalent of 3 teaspoons of sugar. The banana will do the same. The bowl of oats, particularly if it's processed oats like this one was, will probably raise your blood glucose equivalent of probably 4 or 5 teaspoons of sugar. So right there is a lack of knowledge about what diabetes is. And if all we need to do is educate people about what makes blood glucose go up, so therefore what do we do to bring it down? It's as simple as that. So if you can remove the food groups,
and if there's one takeaway from everyone watching this, if there's one takeaway is when you're getting your blood sugar level tested, which I hope you do every year, especially if you're over the age of 40, please make sure you're also asking the doc to prescribe a fasting insulin level as well, because we need, as John beautifully described, we need both of those sets of information to decide which pathway to put you on. I'll just share my own experience in the last 6 months through intermittent fasting. So after COVID, as I said, my HbA1c was at 6.1. It came down to 5.7. My fasting insulin level has now dropped to 5. It's really come down very, very significantly. I've lost 10 kilos of weight. And I've also now started to look at sort of body composition analysis. My body fat came down, visceral fat came down. A lot of my inflammatory markers, HSCRP, etc., all moved in a very positive direction. So it can be this IF technique, along with macro changes, the metabolic flexibility, is a very powerful technique for people. John, we're running out of time, and there's something I really want to ask you before we close up, because it's very dear for both of us as young dads. It's the health of children. It's their well-being. They're the future. We need to look after them. And I know you're involved in so many aspects to do with your Sportz Foundation, the education that you do as well. Can you tell us a little bit about it first, and then we can talk a little bit about educating young parents around how they can be feeding their young mouths?
Look, I talked earlier about our cricketers being my assets on the field. Well, the greatest asset we all have are our children, and we're responsible for those assets throughout their life. But the foundation is the key. The habits they develop as young children is what's going to take them forward through life. And we know from various studies that if we can get to them early with physical education inputs, movement, so improving their overall physical literacy, as well as educating them on the basics around nutrition and diet, then that's going to significantly help them later on in life in so many areas, not just in health, but also mental health, in cognitive health, and as we talk about longevity. So we need to start early with our kids, and that's the key message here. And that's why I'm so passionate about sports education, because that's the platform for us to start intervening at a much earlier age to get the best out of our kids. And the famous LOOK LOOK study by Dr. Dick Telford out of Australia, which is a longitudinal large cohort study that's been running for about 10 or 11 years now, gives us the information to show and prove that not only do we improve the health markers of our kids. So that study basically was around looking at the implementation of well-structured physical education curriculums within the education platform and the outcomes for kids as they move into adulthood. And it just showed that the kids that were involved in well-structured, frequent physical education, what influence it had, not only in their physical markers positively and all their lipid markers and glucose markers moving into adulthood, but the effect that it had on their academic scores and outcomes. So this whole cognitive, benefit of kids being mobile and active is critical. So I see us, or the responsibility of us as parents, is to look after our assets by introducing movement as much as possible and as early as possible, structured physical education, and that doesn't mean sports. That means movement again, and keeping kids active, and then instilling in them the basics around nutrition and why we think it's so important, because those habits are what they will take forward for the rest of their lives, and that's the responsibility that we as parents have, and the feedback that I get from the parents that I work with is that, particularly as they're a little bit older, is, gee, I wish we'd started this process much earlier. It's developing what we call motor competence. So the ability for a child to develop the basic skills, we only have a certain time frame for them to develop those. So motor competence skills such as hopping, jumping, running, throwing, catching, those sorts of skills can really only be acquired up to about sort of 11 or 12 years of age. So we do have a time span and a time frame that we need to work with. So start them early, start them developing these basic motor competence skills, because then at least they have those skills in place to allow them to be physically active and mobile and interact in sports or participate in sports later on in life if they choose to. But it just gives them the tools to allow them to be better physically or better physical beings as they become adults.
Yeah. And I think the big takeaway is that, and I think this is true of some cultures particularly, we have a heavy emphasis on academia and mental development. What we need to do as parents, as guardians of those assets, particularly in their younger years, is ensure that they have a holistic development, which includes the physical component. And what the science is now irrefutable is that is very tightly interwound, that the more physical activity you get, the better your diet is, the nutrition is, the better you're going to be at your exams, at performance in various academic tasks and intellectual capabilities as well, right?
There's so many studies. Doc, one of the talks that I do is I have a talk called Physical Education, the Compulsory Curriculum. So I argue the case is why PE should be compulsory in every curriculum in every school across the world. Because the argument I hear all the time in India is that, if he does sports, if my child does sports, then that takes away from their academic time, and academics is really critical for kids in this country. Yeah. So the argument, and all the studies show, like the Look study, the don't walk in the hallways study out of Canada, there's countless studies that prove and show the link that increased physical activity and better cognitive function and better academic outcomes. There is no argument anymore around this. So parents need to be educated as much as the child around why we're doing what we're doing and why it is important for kids to keep moving and why kids need to be physically active. And also the nutrition. There's certain fuels that the young brain needs to be better developed and better cognitively. So you combine physical activity and movement with better nutrition, and suddenly you have not only improved academic outcomes, but all the other positive outcomes that we talked about around physical well-being, mental health well-being, etc. So this is critical, and the younger we can start that process, the better.
Where can people find more about this work that you're doing, John?
Yeah, look, there'll be quite a few postings on YouTube, I'm sure, of many talks that I've done, but at the moment, I'm in the process of trying to put together some publications around, in this space. But I'm really happy, and I'm more than happy to one day even on this platform to perhaps deliver that talk around physical education, because I really think it's critical that parents are educated as much as anybody around why we need to be doing this, and it's totally within our control, particularly now during the COVID and in the context of COVID, where we do have the time, and we do have the time with our children to take over this part of their life, to ensure that they're getting that physical activity, to monitor their nutritional intake, because they're with us now all the time. So I'm available for anybody who needs me to sort of expand on these conversations at any point in time.
Fabulous. No, that's definitely an offer. I'm going to bring you back on for season 2, which is gearing towards longevity, and clearly looking at a child's health is the right platform, the right foundation to set ourselves up for a life to get to 120 and be happy and healthy along the way as well. John, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the air. There's so many questions I haven't had a chance to ask you, but of course we have many more opportunities to catch up for sure. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time today and for sharing your wisdom with the world on the edge.
My pleasure, Doc M. And again, you and I both have a responsibility to keep delivering on these platforms, and you've done a wonderful job. And I know we literally just tipped the iceberg here, but there's so much more that we can unpack and use that knowledge that we both have to benefit the general population, but most importantly, our kids. So yeah, I'll take you up on that offer anytime to come back on and keep talking.
All right. Awesome. Everyone, thank you for joining us. I'll see you next time on The Edge. Bye-bye.